pleasing to the masses. No one guy ever sat down and decided that this specific look shall be our culture's symbol for snowman. It's just a standardized depiction that gradually evolved. The same thing happened with Santa. Over time, he just gradually turned into this. But that said, several aspects of our now standard snowman design do carry various relics of Victorian times. The snowman's iconic top hat, for instance, was a very fashionable and often quite expensive type of hat that first emerged in the 19th century. So it would have read as a kind of comically pretentious thing to put on a snowman back then. Same with the now politically incorrect cliche of having a snowman smoking a pipe, which again would have originally been seen as a kind of amusingly pompous thing for a snowman to be doing, since pipe smoking was often associated with gentlemanliness. The Victorians had a much simpler sense of humor when it came to these sorts of things, so getting a postcard of a snowman looking like this would have surely been a real laugh riot. I mean, a snowman with a top hat and a pipe? How impossibly droll. The stereotypical snowman always has buttons down his front, because that would have been an easy way to indicate that he was wearing clothes. And of course, everybody's shirts and jackets only had buttons in the 19th century, since zippers didn't go mainstream until the 1930s. Those buttons, as well as his eyes and mouth, are made out of coal, which was something a lot more people had access to in Victorian times than we do now. In England especially, basically everybody used coal-powered fireplaces to heat their homes, and this only really started to decline in the 1960s once gas heating went mainstream. Incidentally, this is where the whole cliche about getting coal for Christmas if you're bad comes from. Today, we think of getting coal as like a punishment because it's so ugly and useless. But back in Victorian times, it was basically just the equivalent of like getting socks, you know, something boring and practical, something useful, but not fun. Speaking of practical, the cliche of the snowman holding a broom is another example of just giving the snowman something that was lying around the house. This modern yellow type of broom was invented in 19th century America, a byproduct of an agricultural boom in a crop known as broom corn that made much nicer, longer-lasting broom bristles than the older kind made of sticks, as well as a new broom-making machine that allowed brooms to be churned out in large quantities in specialized broom-making factories. A high-quality factory-made broom became a proud object for middle-class homemakers in America and Britain, and was particularly useful during the winter when a mother would use it to sweep the snow off the front steps and the walkway and that sort of thing. And the carrot nose? Well, that just reflects the growing popularity of carrots in the late 19th century. According to this excellent book on the history of vegetables, How Carrots Won the Trojan War, carrots didn't look like they do today until relatively recently, with the breed of thick, pointy orange carrot that we all know and love having been simultaneously developed in France and Massachusetts during the 1870s. A lot of fruits and vegetables were only bred into their modern forms in the Victorian era, as we learned in my award-winning video on the history of candy. But anyway, carrots became a much more popular thing to eat around this time, and as the pointiest of all the vegetables, they made for a natural snowman nose. Many decades later, in 1950, the snowman would become even more canonized into American Christmas lore when noted American songsmiths Jack Rowlands and Steve Nelson wrote Frosty the Snowman, which proceeded to be covered by all of the big crooners of the time. And this was critical in that it gave the generic stock Christmas snowman character a name for the first time, and entrenched his appearance as a guy with a silk hat on his head and a broomstick in his hand. I've always found it strange, however, that the song refers to him as having a button nose instead of a carrot nose, even though snowmen with carrot noses were a very well-established cliche by then, and carrot and button have the same number of syllables. Button-nosed snowmen are probably cuter, though. All right, and speaking of men, let us now talk about gingerbread men. So gingerbread is a very old type of cookie, probably first dreamed up by German bakers around the 14th century. And if you've ever eaten gingerbread, you will know that it is not super sweet, but rather pretty gingery. And this is because gingerbread is a relic of a time when sugar was much less common than it is now, meaning that a lot of sweets had to rely on other ingredients to give them flavor, like herbs, spices, and fragrant roots, like ginger. You could maybe use a little bit of sugar for like some thin strips of icing around the edges. By the way, this is why we use the seemingly redundant term sugar cookie to describe a different type of Christmas treat. It's a throwback to a time when making a cookie whose primary ingredient was sugar was unusual enough to be notable. Today, of course, even your most generic grocery store Christmas cookie probably contains like 10 times as much sugar as even the sugariest Victorian-era sugar cookie. The reason we call this stuff gingerbread, meanwhile, is just because in the old days people used terms like bread and biscuit interchangeably to refer to both cookies and normal bread alike. Hence why we also talk about shortbread and buttermilk biscuits. Now, as I alluded to when we were talking about snowmen, late 19th century Christmas culture in America was largely imported from late 19th century Christmas culture in Britain. In a previous video, I think I described this as basically the last era where Britain exercised major cultural influence on the US before the balance of power shifted and America started exercising greater cultural influence over Britain. But in any case, the huge growth of Christmas culture in Victorian Britain was a very nostalgic movement based around reclaiming rituals from England's heavily sentimentalized Anglo-Saxon past. And this meant embracing Christmas customs that were popular in the most traditionalistic parts of Germany, like Bavaria, the gingerbread capital of Europe. In other words, if gingerbread strikes you as a kind of weird and exotic and old-fashioned thing to be eating, well, that's always been kind of the point. I don't think there's any real deep meaning as to why we make gingerbread into man-shaped cookies in particular. Historically, traditional German cookie artisans made gingerbread into all sorts of fancy shapes, a heritage we still honor today when we make elaborate gingerbread houses and other architectural marvels. When you look at old Victorian Christmas cards, it was actually common to depict gingerbread hearts, since that was the most traditional Bavarian shape. Gingerbread men probably just rose in popularity as something that would be fun for the kids, since the Victorians were putting a lot of effort into reimagining Christmas as a very child-centric holiday, which in turn reflected a growing sense among middle-class people in Britain and America that children should live happy lives full of joy and presents rather than being sent to toil away in the fields all day. I mean, it is kind of charming, isn't it? Christmas is a happy time, and I think it is important to remember that a lot of Christmas traditions are just rooted in doing nice things for children. The fairy tale of the Gingerbread Man, which would go on to inspire the beloved Gingy character from Shrek, is American in origin. It first appeared in the May 1875 issue of a children's magazine called, fittingly enough, St. Nicholas. Hanging stockings and getting them filled with treats is one of the Western world's longest-running Christmas traditions and has been practiced in some form for centuries and possibly even millennia. No one really seems to know exactly where it came from, but based on what I've read, the dominant theory seems to be that it was originally a pagan thing. Supposedly, at one time, people made offerings to some ancient god by leaving out valuable things in their shoes, which presumably arose from ancient beliefs involving shoes as a symbol of humility or prostration. And then, over time, this was incorporated into Christianity and Christmas, with kids making offerings to Jesus or St. Nicholas with their shoes, who would then reward them with treats. This book about Santa Claus has a great quote from a 16th century Calvinist preacher denouncing the paganism of all of this.
It is a foolish and pointless custom to fill children's shoes with all sorts of sweets and nonsense. What else is this but sacrifice to an idol? Those who do it do not seem to understand what true religion is.
It was actually not uncommon for a lot of Protestants at that time to consider most Christmas celebrations to be fairly paganistic. And it wasn't until the Victorian age that this sort of opposition began to fade away, in part because the Christian leaders of that time were getting a lot more chill as society was growing more and more secular. Now, there are some parts of Europe, most notably Holland, where children still get presents in their shoes